Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, so we've talked about the agenda setting effect. The more the media covers a particular issue, the more importance people place on it. The priming effect, that the more the media focuses on an issue or an attribute, something about a politician or something, or a party, the more, that's how we evaluate our leaders and our parties. Again, in both cases, the media is telling you not what to think, but what to think about. The media is very good at telling you what to think about, all of us. And by the way, people who watch the news a lot are equally susceptible to these effects. It's not like just like dumb people are affected by the media in this way. The people who pay attention to the news a lot are the ones who are also affected. Me, you, everybody is. The next thing I want to talk about is something called framing effects. Framing effects. And this one's a little bit more complicated, but it's basically the same idea. The manner in which a reporter interprets the meaning of events affects citizens' understanding of those events. How they interpret an event and the meaning of an event will affect how we understand that event. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. A while back, there was the Ku Klux Klan was having a rally. And being the Ku Klux Klan, they wanted to have a rally in a Jewish neighborhood because they hate Jews. So why not piss these people off, right? That's the MO. It's the Klan. So I want you to imagine I'm a reporter, and this actually happened, this Klan rally, but I'm not going to talk about what actually happened. But I will tell you this, that I saw the actual coverage, and there was this one Jewish guy who, I guess he had decided that he was going to break up the rally as best he could. And so as I was watching the coverage, you see this guy like rush through the police lines and just cold cock the Grand Poobah, the head Klan guy, just clocks him. And the police dragged him out of there quickly, right, with his fist pumped in the air, with the crowd applauding. And I don't condone violence, but I have to tell you I was smiling. Okay, so but violence is bad. So suppose is that convincing? I'll have to look back later on and see if I was convincing. Like that didn't bite at all. So suppose I'm the producer of a TV news program, and I go ahead and I hear about the Klan rally, and I go ahead and I say, okay, look, you know what? I'm going to send some reporters down there to cover the rally. So I send Eddie down there, and I say, I want you to cover the rally.
I used to be a photojournalist.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Excellent. Knowing that Eddie was a photojournalist, I decided to send him down there. Okay, and as it turns out, he's a photojournalist, but he hates it because he really wants to be a lawyer, right? So Eddie goes down there, and he's like, how am I going to tell this story about the Klan rally? You always want to find an angle, a way to tell the story that's going to make it interesting. So, because he's a lawyer, he's interested in this whole question of free speech. Should they be allowed to speak? You know, we have free speech in the country, we have the First Amendment, but then they're going into this neighborhood and they're purposely pissing people off. Is that cool? So he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to interview the head of the Klan. I'm going to interview one of the leaders of the Jewish community, and then I'm going to go interview some law professors and ask them what they think. Right? And so finally gets all this stuff together. He says, this is Eddie reporting from Schenectady, New York. Starts talking about the Klan rally, talks about how there's this big issue of freedom of speech. They show a clip of him interviewing the Klan guy, the Jewish person, the professor, another professor. Comes back to Eddie, he says something like, so this question isn't going to be settled today, but this is Eddie reporting from Schenectady, New York. Boom. Done. Anything wrong with that report? Is that a good report, a bad report? Is there something wrong?
Right down the middle.
Pardon?
It didn't give you like a verdict?
Didn't give you a verdict, just laid out the whole thing and then boom.
Unbiased version of
No, anything wrong with that? No. Great. Okay, so let's say Eddie goes and he does a report, but I want to make sure because, sometimes he doesn't show up on time, so I'm going to send another reporter out there just to make sure. I send Kim down there as well. Kim's going to do a story too. Turns out Kim wants to be a cop. Right, so she's got a completely different angle on this whole thing. So she's going to go ahead and she's going to interview the Klan member. She's going to interview the Jewish community leader. But she's going to interview the chief of police. Because her whole angle is, man, is this thing going to turn into a riot? Is there going to be violence? Is this going to get out of hand? And so she does her report and she says, tensions are building in Schenectady, New York. The Klan member saying something defiant, the Jewish community leader saying something defiant, the police, chief saying, we're going to make sure that everybody's going to be safe and everybody can go ahead and that nobody needs to worry about it. Comes back, everything appears to be okay and makes a little tension there and then says, Kim Gerby reporting from Schenectady, New York, boom, done. Anything wrong with her report? Both of them totally legitimate. What Eddie has used is what we call a free speech frame. He interpreted the event as being something about freedom of speech, and that's how he told the story. He interpreted this rally as being an issue about free speech, and so he framed his report around this idea of should they be allowed to speak or shouldn't they? Do they have free speech or don't they? Should the Jewish community have to listen to it? It's framed around this idea of free speech. Kim's report was framed around this idea of public safety. She interpreted this as a potentially dangerous event where there could be a clash. The manner in which a reporter interprets the meaning of events affects how we understand those events. So if you go ahead and you flip on the TV, you're kicking back and you're watching the news, and you flip it on, and Eddie's report's on, and you see the whole free speech report, you watch it, it's like, okay, cool. Later on, you're making dinner, your wife says, or your husband says, or your boyfriend or girlfriend says, hey, I heard something about a rally in New York. When you go ahead and you explain what you know about the rally, aren't you going to explain it in terms of free speech? Like, yeah, apparently there's a big debate over whether or not the Klan members should be able to go ahead and speak at this rally. If you saw Kim's report, wouldn't you say, yeah, apparently there's going to be this clash, and the police say it's going to be okay and everything, but there's apparently some tension about this rally that's going to be going on. If you hear the free speech frame, you're going to understand that in terms of free speech. If you hear the public safety frame, you're going to hear it in terms of public safety. And that's how you're going to think about it. The media won't be able to tell you whether you should think the Klan should be able to speak or not. They won't be able to tell you what to think. But they will be able to affect what you're thinking about. Same thing, a subtle effect. Same thing here. The media won't be able to tell you what to think about should they just cancel this thing if it's going to be violent. They won't be able to tell you what you should think about whether the rally should be held or not. But they will be able to shape what you're thinking about. Okay? Framing effects. Now, go ahead.
Would there be a different outcome if the person hears both? Like,
If you got both of them?
yeah,
Yeah, probably. I mean, what's your intuition? What do you think would happen?
I guess they would just pick parts of each one.
Yeah, I think probably whichever one resonated the most with you. Like, I mean, if people were presented with these two, which one do you think would capture people's attention the most? Yeah, the public safety ones. My suspicion is if you got both of these, probably this would be the one you'd be thinking about. I bet the closer you live to where the rallies are going to be. Right, if you're on the other side of the country, it's like, there's this really interesting question about free speech, right? If you're in Schenectady, New York, it's like, yeah, apparently there's going to be some violence. Yeah, but yeah, it would be both. Now, this guy named Shanto Iyengar wrote a book called Is Anyone Responsible? And it was all about framing. The whole book about framing. This is what people do.
About what?
Framing.
Oh.
But a particular kind of framing that he was interested in doing. So I want to talk to you about two different kinds of frames. And for those of you who watch the news, you never knew what this stuff was called, but you've seen this over and over again if you watch the news. There's something called episodic frames, and there's something called thematic frames. In an episodic frame is when the media goes ahead and focuses on an individual or individuals to talk about a bigger issue. So, for example, suppose a news reporter is doing coverage of poverty. They're going to do a story on poverty. If they're using an episodic frame, what they're going to do is they're going to go find somebody who's homeless, or they're going to find somebody who's living in a shelter, and they're going to interview that person. They're going to focus in on that person, and they're going to interview them. If they're living in their car, they're going to take pictures of the way they're living in their car. If they're living under a bridge, they're going to show you real dramatic images of, them with all their kids huddled in a small room or something like that. They're going to tell you, they're going to pick out Joe the homeless guy. I don't know why the homeless guy's name is always Joe, but it is. Joe the homeless guy, and they're going to tell you a story about Joe the homeless guy in order to tell a bigger story about poverty. Let me tell you about Joe, and you can extrapolate from Joe to the rest of society. That's called an episodic frame. And the reason we call it episodic, it comes from the word episode. Like an episode is like one episode, like one instance of poverty, one episode of poverty. So Joe the homeless guy is one episode of poverty, one guy. So an episodic frame, you focus on one person to tell a bigger story. If you're doing an episodic frame about, using an episodic frame because you want to talk about injuries in football, you go ahead and you find a football player who's paralyzed or something, who played football and got to his first year of college ball, got hit, and now he's paralyzed. And you tell the story of this one guy as a way of telling the bigger story about the dangers of football. You focus on the one guy. That is an episodic frame. So think episode. You have one episode, it's one person, or sometimes persons. A thematic frame, and thematic comes from theme. A thematic frame is where you just focus on the bigger issue. So again, if you're doing a thematic frame and you're telling a story, you're doing a report on poverty, in that case, you wouldn't focus on an individual. You would talk about general patterns of poverty. Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Who's most hard hit by it, right? What groups? You talk to experts about poverty and how it's affecting society. Talk to experts about the impact of poverty on society. What's it doing to kids? What does that mean when they get older? You're going to talk about the big picture. Up here, you're focusing on one guy. Over here, you're talking about the big picture. Okay, see the difference? But if you're doing a thematic report on football's injuries in football, you would go ahead and show stats of the number of injuries over the years, right? You might show the costs associated with caring for football players, the average age of somebody who's been really injured, stuff like that. You're going to tell big picture stuff. You're not going to focus in on an individual. Big picture stuff. But before we continue on with the findings of the study, let me ask you a question, kind of built off what we talked about before. If you're a journalist and you can do an episodic frame, somebody tells you, I want you to go do a report on education, and you can do an episodic frame or you can do a thematic frame, what are you going to do?